The glass shattered against the stone floor like her heart had shattered 3 years ago. "Do you remember me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper in the grand ballroom where hundreds of candles flickered like dying stars. Lord Alexander Blackwood turned slowly, his champagne glass forgotten, his face draining of all color, as if he'd seen a ghost. Perhaps he had. His dark eyes, those same eyes that had once promised her forever, widened in recognition, then filled with tears that caught the candlelight like liquid diamonds. His tears answered before his words ever could. "Catherine," he breathed, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer and a curse all at once. The music stopped, the dancers froze, the entire world seemed to pause as thunder rolled across the Yorkshire countryside, rattling the windows of Ravenshollow Manor. Rain began to strike the glass like angry fists, as if the heavens themselves were weeping for what had been lost. She stood there in her simple brown dress, so different from the silks and jewels that surrounded her, clutching a worn leather letter in her trembling hand. The letter that had brought her here, the letter that would destroy everything he'd built in her absence. "I thought you were dead," he whispered, taking one step toward her, then stopping as if an invisible wall stood between them. Catherine smiled, but it was a smile full of thorns. "Perhaps I was." The storm outside grew fierce, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, or perhaps it was just the wind through the moors, carrying secrets that should have stayed buried forever. 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days. Catherine had counted every single one since the night she'd fled Ravenshollow Manor with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a heart so shattered she'd thought it might never beat properly again. She'd learned to live with the ache, the way one learns to live with a missing limb, never quite whole but functional enough to survive. The cottage where she now lived sat on the edge of Whitmore village, small and humble, with roses that she tended each morning as the sun painted the sky pink and gold. The roses had been her salvation. Their thorns reminded her that beautiful things could wound you, but their blooms reminded her that broken things could still create beauty. Every morning she'd wake and touch the small silver locket at her throat, the one gift from Alexander she'd been unable to leave behind. Inside was a miniature portrait of them together, painted during those golden weeks when she'd believed love could conquer anything. How naive she'd been. The village women whispered about her, of course. A young woman alone with no family name they recognized, and a sadness that clung to her like morning mist. They called her the ghost girl behind her back, because she moved through life like she was only half there, as if part of her soul had been left somewhere else entirely. Miss Catherine, Mrs. Hartwell had said just that morning as Catherine sold her roses at the market. "Surely a girl as lovely as you should be thinking of marriage. There's young Thomas Miller. He's got his eye on you, you know." But Catherine had only smiled politely and shaken her head. How could she explain? How could she tell them that her heart was buried in a grave that bore no name, mourning a love that everyone believed had never existed? She'd made her peace with loneliness, or so she'd told herself. Then came the letter. It had arrived 3 days ago, carried by a messenger in Blackwood livery, colors she recognized even after all this time. Her hands had shaken so violently she'd nearly dropped it twice before she'd managed to break the seal. Miss Catherine wrote, "You are cordially invited to attend the engagement celebration of Lord Alexander Blackwood to Lady Victoria Pemberton. The ceremony will take place at Ravenshollow Manor on the 15th of October, by order of the Dowager Countess Blackwood." An invitation to watch the man she'd loved, still loved, God help her, pledge himself to another woman. It was cruel. It was calculated. It was exactly what she'd expected from Alexander's mother, the iron-willed woman who'd made it clear 3 years ago that Catherine Rose, daughter of a blacksmith, would never be suitable for her precious son. Catherine had stared at that invitation for hours, her fingers tracing the elegant script. Part of her wanted to throw it into the fire and pretend it had never come, but another part, the part that had never stopped loving him, despite everything, whispered that she needed to see him one more time. Not to win him back. That ship had sailed long ago on a tide of bitter tears and broken promises, but to ask him one simple question: did you ever love me at all, or was I just a pleasant distraction for a bored young lord? She'd spent 3 days deciding. 3 days remembering the way he'd kissed her in the moonlight, the way he'd promised they'd find a way to be together despite their different stations. 3 days remembering how he'd said nothing, not one word, when his mother had banished her like she was nothing more than a troublesome servant. On the 3rd day, she'd made her choice. She'd walked 15 miles through the rain, her worn boots splashing through puddles, her simple brown dress growing heavier with each step. By the time she'd reached Ravenshollow Manor, she was soaked to the skin, her hair plastered to her head, looking every inch the poor village girl his family had always believed her to be. The doorman had tried to turn her away, of course, but Catherine had shown him the invitation, and he'd reluctantly let her slip inside through the servants' entrance. The manor looked exactly as she remembered, all gleaming marble and crystal chandeliers, oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors watching from gilded frames. She'd hidden in the shadows, watching the celebration unfold, watching Alexander smile and laugh and play the perfect bridegroom-to-be. He looked older, more serious. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, and something in his posture spoke of burdens carried and dreams abandoned. But he was still beautiful in that way that had always stolen her breath, tall and dark-haired, with those deep blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. And then, when she could bear it no longer, she'd stepped into the light. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that 3 years had carved. Alexander's tears fell unchecked now, tracking silver paths down his aristocratic cheekbones, and Catherine felt her own resolve wavering. She hadn't expected tears. She'd expected coldness, perhaps indifference. She'd prepared herself for cruelty, but not for this raw, desperate grief that seemed to pour from him like water from a broken dam. "You came," he whispered, and his voice was hoarse, broken. "After everything, you came. Did you think I wouldn't?" The words slipped out before she could stop them, sharper than she'd intended. Around them, the other guests had begun to whisper, a low buzzing like angry bees. She could feel their stares, their judgment, their curiosity burning against her skin. "I thought," Alexander started, then stopped, shaking his head. "I hoped, God forgive me, I hoped you were alive somewhere, but I never dared to believe." "Believe what?" Catherine stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, the same cedar and bergamot scent that used to cling to his letters. "That I survived your abandonment? That I picked up the pieces of my life after you threw me away like a broken toy?" He flinched, as if she'd struck him. "Catherine, you don't understand." "Then explain it to me." She held up the invitation, the paper trembling in her grip. "Explain why your mother sent me this. Explain why you're marrying her." Her eyes found Lady Victoria across the room, a beautiful blonde woman in sapphire silk, currently staring at them with undisguised horror. "Explain why you never came for me." The storm outside chose that moment to unleash its full fury. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the tall windows in stark white light, and thunder shook the very foundations of the manor. Several guests gasped and moved away from the windows, but Catherine and Alexander remained frozen in their bubble of pain and memory. "I did come for you," Alexander said suddenly, so quietly she almost didn't hear him over the storm. "I came the very next morning after my mother told me what she'd done, but you were gone. Your cottage was empty. Even your roses were dead. Catherine's breath caught. What? I searched for you, Catherine. For months. I hired investigators. I rode to every village within 100 miles. I thought... His voice broke completely. I thought you might have, that the scandal had been too much. You thought I'd killed myself? The words came out as a strangled laugh.
Oh, Alexander.
You always did think too highly of my devotion. Don't. His hand reached toward her, then fell to his side. Don't make light of it. I nearly went mad thinking I'd lost you forever, that my cowardice had driven you to... Cowardice? Catherine's temper flared, hot and bright. Is that what you call it? When your mother dragged me from my bed in the middle of the night, had her footman throw me into a carriage, and told me you never wanted to see me again, when she said you'd laughed at my presumption, that you'd been amusing yourself with the blacksmith's daughter, but would never lower yourself to actually marry me. Alexander went utterly still. The color that had returned to his face drained away again, leaving him pale as parchment. She told you what? She said you knew. She said it was your idea. No. The word exploded from him like a gunshot. No, Catherine. No. I would never. He grabbed her shoulders, his fingers digging into her damp dress. I swear to you on my father's grave, I knew nothing about it until I woke and found you gone. Mother told me you'd left in the night, that you'd realized our situation was impossible and chosen to spare us both the scandal. The leather letter crinkled in Catherine's fist. Around them, the whispers were growing louder, more urgent. She could see Lady Victoria pushing through the crowd toward them, her face a mask of confusion and dawning alarm. She lied to both of us, Catherine whispered, the truth settling over her like ice water. Catherine, Alexander's voice was desperate now, pleading, tell me you believe me, tell me you know I would never have hurt you deliberately. She looked into his eyes, those same blue eyes that had haunted her dreams for 3 long years, and saw the truth there, raw and painful and absolutely genuine. He'd been as much a victim of his mother's manipulation as she had been. Alexander. Lady Victoria's voice cut through the storm like a blade. She'd reached them now, her perfect features marred by worry and something that might have been fear. What's happening? Who is this woman? Catherine felt Alexander's hands fall away from her shoulders, felt him step back, creating proper distance between them, felt the walls of duty and propriety slam back into place between them, like prison bars. Victoria, he said, and Catherine heard him struggle to find his composure. This is an old friend. Miss Catherine Rose. Friend. The word hit Catherine like a physical blow. After everything they'd shared, everything they'd been to each other, she was now just an old friend. Miss Rose. Lady Victoria's voice was cool, polite, but her green eyes were sharp with intelligence. She wasn't fooled for a moment. How unexpected to see you here. Yes, Catherine said, forcing her own voice to remain steady. Unexpected. She looked between Alexander and his intended bride, seeing the way Victoria's hand possessively claimed his arm, the way Alexander's jaw tightened, as if he were in physical pain. The leather letter in her hand seemed to burn against her palm. The real reason she'd come here tonight, not just to see him, but to deliver the message that would change everything. Actually, Catherine said, her decision crystallizing like ice in the winter air, I came here tonight to deliver something to you, Lord Blackwood. Something I think you'll find illuminating. She held out the letter, not the invitation, but the other letter, the one that had arrived with it, sealed with different wax, bearing different handwriting. The letter that would shatter his engagement and possibly destroy them all. Alexander stared at it as if it were a snake that might strike. What is it? The truth, Catherine said simply. The truth about why I really left that night 3 years ago, and the truth about what your mother has been hiding from you ever since. Thunder crashed overhead, like the sound of worlds colliding. Alexander's study felt smaller than Catherine remembered, though nothing had changed. The same leather-bound books lined the walls, the same Persian carpet covered the floor, the same portrait of his father watched from above the fireplace with painted eyes that seemed to hold judgment for the living. But everything was different now. The air itself seemed charged with electricity from more than just the storm raging outside. "Read it," Catherine said, standing near the window where lightning continued to illuminate the darkness. She'd handed him the letter 10 minutes ago, but he hadn't broken the seal. His hands trembled as he held it, and she could see the war being fought behind his eyes, the desire to know battling against the fear of what knowledge might cost him. "Catherine," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "If I read this, if what you're suggesting is true, it will change everything. Everything changed the night I was forced to leave." She turned from the window to face him fully. "The question is whether you're brave enough to finally learn why." Victoria had been left downstairs with some excuse about urgent estate business. The guests continued their celebration, unaware that the foundation of their host's entire world was about to crumble. Catherine could hear the distant sound of music and laughter drifting up through the floorboards, a grotesque soundtrack to their confrontation. Alexander moved to his desk, setting the letter down as if it might explode. The candlelight caught the planes of his face, throwing shadows that made him look haggard, older than his 28 years. "You have to understand," he said, not looking at her. "When you disappeared, when Mother told me you'd chosen to leave, it nearly destroyed me. But I rebuilt my life. I found a way to function, to fulfill my duties. Victoria is a good woman. She doesn't deserve to be hurt by whatever this is." "And what about what I deserved?" The words slipped out before Catherine could stop them, raw with 3 years of suppressed pain. "Did I deserve to be torn from my bed in the middle of the night? Did I deserve to be threatened and thrown into a carriage like a criminal? Did I deserve to be told that the man I loved had never cared for me at all?" Alexander's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers across the room. "You still love me?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact that hung in the air between them like a confession neither had meant to make. Catherine's breath caught. She'd said too much, revealed too much. "It doesn't matter now, doesn't it?" He stood, moving around the desk toward her with the same graceful predator's walk that had once made her heart race. "Because I never stopped loving you, Catherine, not for a single day in 3 years. I've gone through the motions of living, but I've been dead inside since the morning I found you gone. Don't." She backed against the window, the cold glass shocking against her spine. "Don't say that. Not when you're engaged to marry another woman in 2 days. An engagement built on lies." His control finally snapped, and he slammed his palm against the wall beside her head, caging her against the window. "Don't you see? If Mother lied to you, if she manipulated both of us, then everything I've built since then is meaningless. My engagement, my duties, my careful, empty life, all of it based on the belief that you chose to leave me." She could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell that achingly familiar scent of cedar and bergamot that belonged to him alone. For a moment she was 20 again, innocent and desperately in love, believing that passion could overcome any obstacle. Alexander. His name was a whisper on her lips. "You don't understand. The letter, it's not just about what your mother did to me." "Then what?" His free hand rose to cup her face, thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. "What could be worse than losing you?" Catherine closed her eyes, steeling herself for what she had to tell him. When she opened them again, she saw her own pain reflected in his face, and her heart broke all over again. I didn't just leave that night, Alexander. I was taken somewhere your mother thought I could never return from. His hand stilled against her cheek. What do you mean? Read the letter, she whispered. Please. It's from Dr. Marcus Whitfield at the Bedlam Royal Hospital in London.
Alexander went rigid.
Bedlam. The notorious asylum for the insane. Everyone in England knew its reputation. A place where inconvenient people disappeared forever. He dropped his hand from her face and stepped back, his expression shifting from confusion to horror. No, she wouldn't. Even Mother wouldn't. She had me committed as a madwoman, Catherine said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. She told them I was delusional, that I believed myself to be engaged to a lord far above my station. She had me locked away where no one would ever believe anything I said. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander sank into the chair behind his desk as if his legs could no longer support him. How long? He asked, his voice barely audible. 2 years. Catherine wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the fire crackling in the grate. 2 years of being told I was mad, of being treated like an animal, of having doctors try to cure me of loving you. Dear God. Alexander buried his face in his hands. Catherine, I'm so sorry. I'm so goddamned sorry. I survived because of Dr. Whitfield, she continued, needing to tell him everything now that she'd started. He was new to Bedlam, younger, more progressive than the others. After 6 months, he began to suspect that I wasn't actually insane. It took him another year to find proof of what your mother had done. The forged documents, the bribes, the lies. When he finally secured my release, he helped me start over in Whitmore Village. Alexander looked up at her, his face streaked with tears. The letter, what does it say? Read it yourself. With shaking hands, he broke the seal and unfolded the paper. Catherine watched his face as he read, saw the moment when Dr. Whitfield's carefully documented accusations hit home. The color drained from his skin completely, and when he finished, he let the letter fall to the desk. She destroyed you, he said numbly. My own mother destroyed the woman I loved, and let me believe it was your choice. There's more, Catherine said quietly. Dr. Whitfield didn't just write to tell you what happened to me. He wrote to warn you. Alexander's eyes snapped to hers. Warn me about what? Your mother isn't just trying to control your marriage, Alexander. She's trying to control your entire inheritance. Dr. Whitfield discovered that she's been systematically removing anyone who might threaten her power over the Blackwood estate. I wasn't the first inconvenient person she had committed to Bedlam. The room seemed to spin around Alexander. Who else? Your cousin James, the one who supposedly died in a hunting accident 2 years ago. He's alive, Alexander. He's been in Bedlam this entire time, committed by your mother after he discovered her embezzling from the estate funds. Alexander shot to his feet so quickly, his chair toppled backward. James is alive? Dr. Whitfield has been working to gather evidence against your mother for months. He wanted to warn you before your wedding, before she gains even more legal control over your affairs through your marriage to Lady Victoria. Victoria? Alexander ran his hands through his dark hair, pacing like a caged animal. Does she know? Is she part of this? I don't think so, Catherine said carefully. But her father stands to gain significantly from your marriage. The business arrangements, the property mergers. If something were to happen to you after the wedding,
I'd be worth more dead than alive, Alexander finished grimly, and Mother would control everything as my widow's guardian until any children came of age.
The implications hung between them like a death sentence. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to subside, but inside the study, A different kind of tempest was just beginning. "What do I do?" Alexander asked, turning to face her. "How do I prove any of this without putting James and Dr. Whitfield in danger? How do I expose Mother without destroying innocent people like Victoria?" Catherine moved toward him, her heart aching at the lost, desperate look in his eyes. Without thinking, she reached up and touched his face, the same gesture he'd made to her moments before. "We do it together," she said softly. "The way we should have done everything from the beginning." "Catherine," her name was a prayer on his lips. "I can't ask you to." "You're not asking, I'm offering." She stepped closer, close enough that their bodies were almost touching. "I've been hiding for 3 years, Alexander. I've been surviving instead of living. But seeing you tonight, knowing the truth, I can't run anymore. Not from this. Not from you." His hands came up to frame her face, thumbs brushing away the tears she didn't realize were still falling. "If we do this, there's no going back. Once we expose Mother, once we reveal what she's done, the scandal will destroy both of us. You'll never be able to live quietly in your village again." "I was never meant for a quiet life," Catherine whispered. "I was meant for you." The kiss, when it came, was inevitable as sunrise. 3 years of separation, of grief, of believing they'd lost each other forever, poured into that single moment of connection. Alexander's mouth was desperate against hers, hungry and reverent all at once, and Catherine felt herself coming alive again for the first time since that terrible night when she'd been torn from his arms. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said. The words fierce and certain. "I never stopped, and I never will. But if we do this, if we fight Mother together, I need you to know that I might lose everything. The title, the estate, everything that makes me worthy of." Catherine silenced him with another kiss, shorter but no less intense. "You were never worthy of me because of a title," she said against his lips. "You were worthy because of this." She placed her hand over his heart, feeling it thunder beneath her palm. "Because of the way you loved me when I was nobody, when I had nothing to offer but my heart. You have everything to offer," Alexander said fiercely. "You're braver than any soldier, stronger than any lady, more beautiful than—" A sharp knock at the study door cut him off. They sprang apart just as Victoria's voice called through the wood. "Alexander, I'm sorry to disturb you, but your mother wishes to speak with you. She says it's urgent." Catherine and Alexander stared at each other, both understanding the terrible irony. The Dowager Countess had unwittingly perfect timing. "Tell her I'll be down in a moment," Alexander called back, his voice admirably steady. "Shall I tell her about your guest?" Victoria asked, and there was something in her tone that suggested she knew more than she was letting on. Alexander looked to Catherine, a question in his eyes. She nodded slightly. "Yes," he said. "Tell Mother that Miss Catherine Rose is here, and that we have much to discuss." Footsteps retreated down the hall, and Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling fire. "She knows," Catherine said quietly. "Somehow your mother knows I'm here." "Then we'd better be ready for war," Alexander replied, reaching for Dr. Whitfield's letter. "Because Georgiana Blackwood has never surrendered anything without a fight." The drawing room felt like a battlefield waiting for the first shot to be fired. Dowager Countess Georgiana Blackwood sat in her high-backed chair like a queen on her throne, her silver hair perfectly arranged despite the late hour, her dark eyes sharp as daggers. She hadn't aged a day in 3 years, Catherine thought bitterly. Evil apparently preserved a person well. Victoria stood beside the fireplace, her engagement ring catching the light as she twisted it nervously around her finger. Her confusion was palpable. She clearly sensed the undercurrents of tension, but couldn't identify their source. And Alexander Alexander stood beside Catherine like a shield, Dr. Whitfield's letter clutched in his hand like a weapon. "Mother," he said, his voice deadly calm, "I believe you remember Miss Catherine Rose." The dowager's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Indeed I do, though I must confess surprise at seeing her here. I was under the impression that Miss Rose had found more suitable accommodations elsewhere." "Bedlam, you mean," Catherine said, stepping forward. "You can say the word, your ladyship. We all know where you sent me." Victoria gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "Bedlam? The asylum? Alexander, what is she talking about?" "Tell her, mother," Alexander said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Tell my fiancée how you had an innocent woman committed to an asylum because she dared to love your son." The dowager's composure never wavered. "I'm afraid Miss Rose has always been prone to dramatic exaggerations. It's part of her condition, you understand." "Is that what you call it?" Catherine's temper flared hot and bright. "A condition? Being dragged from my bed by your footman, told that Alexander never wanted to see me again, then having doctors try to beat the love out of me with ice baths and restraints." "Catherine." Alexander's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "Let me." He held up Dr. Whitfield's letter, and Catherine saw the dowager's eyes narrow almost imperceptibly, the first crack in her perfect mask. "Dr. Marcus Whitfield sends his regards, mother, along with some very interesting documentation about the patients you've had committed over the years. Would you like me to read his findings aloud, or would you prefer to explain yourself first?" The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Victoria looked between them all, her face pale with dawning horror. "Georgiana," she whispered, "please tell me this isn't true. Please tell me you didn't—" "What I did," the dowager said, rising from her chair with regal dignity, "was protect my family, protect our bloodline from a fortune-hunting nobody who would have destroyed everything we've built." "Fortune-hunting?" Catherine laughed, the sound bitter as winter wind. "I never wanted your money. I only wanted Alexander." "Precisely the problem," the dowager snapped, her mask finally slipping. "A blacksmith's daughter, thinking herself worthy of a lord. It was madness, quite literally. I simply helped you find appropriate treatment." "You destroyed her life," Alexander roared, his composure finally cracking. "You let me believe she'd abandoned me while you had her tortured in that hellhole." "I saved you from a ruinous marriage," the dowager shot back. "Just as I saved you from your cousin James's attempts to steal your inheritance." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Victoria's face went white as parchment. "James?" she whispered. "But James is dead. He died in a hunting accident." "No," Alexander said grimly. "He didn't. Did you, mother?" "James isn't dead. He's in Bedlam too, isn't he? Committed by you after he discovered your embezzlement." The dowager's face transformed, all pretense of maternal concern falling away to reveal something cold and calculating beneath. "James was weak," she said with chilling matter-of-factness. "Just like your father was weak. Neither of them understood what it takes to preserve a legacy. James would have squandered the estate on his gambling debts and charitable nonsense. Your father would have given it all away to anyone with a sob story. So you killed him too." Alexander's voice was barely human now, more growl than words. "Your father died of a weak heart," the dowager said. "Though I admit, learning about certain financial discrepancies may have contributed to the stress that brought on his attack." Victoria made a sound like a wounded animal. "Oh God! Oh dear God! What have I gotten myself into?" "Nothing you can't get yourself out of," Catherine said gently, turning to the younger woman. "This isn't your fault, Lady Victoria. You're as much a victim here as anyone. Victim? The Dowager laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Victoria is no victim. She's the solution, a perfect, biddable wife who will give Alexander legitimate heirs while keeping him too busy with domestic duties to look too closely at how the estate is actually run. You're insane. Alexander breathed. I'm practical, his mother corrected. Do you think this estate runs itself? Do you think the servants pay themselves, the tenants manage themselves, the investments make themselves? I've been holding this family together since before you were born, making the hard choices that weak men like your father and James could never make. Hard choices, Catherine repeated, stepping closer to the woman who had destroyed her life. Is that what you call having people falsely imprisoned? Stealing from your son's inheritance? Planning to have him killed after his wedding? The last accusation hit like a thunderbolt. Victoria screamed, a high, piercing sound that cut through the night. Alexander went utterly still. What did you say? He asked, his voice deadly quiet. The carriage accident that was supposed to happen during your honeymoon, Catherine said, her eyes never leaving the Dowager's face. Dr. Whitfield found the correspondence with the men you hired, the same men who arranged James's supposed hunting accident. The Dowager smiled then, expression so cold it seemed to freeze the very air in the room. You always were too clever for your own good, Miss Rose, she said.
Yes, there was to be an accident.
A tragic end to a young couple's happiness. Victoria would inherit everything as Alexander's widow, and as her guardian, given her obvious mental instability following such trauma, I would continue to manage the estate as I always have. Victoria collapsed into a chair, her body shaking with shock. Alexander looked like he'd been struck by lightning. My own mother, he whispered. You would have murdered me. Your own son. I would have preserved the Blackwood legacy, she corrected. Something you've proven incapable of doing yourself. Falling in love with a peasant, allowing sentiment to cloud your judgment. You're as weak as your father was. And if I refuse to marry Victoria, Alexander asked, if I call off the wedding, then you'll suffer the same fate as James and your dear Miss Rose here, a tragic descent into madness, requiring immediate and permanent treatment at Bedlam. The Dowager's smile widened. I've already prepared the documentation. Your recent behavior, calling off your engagement for a convicted madwoman, will provide all the evidence I need. Catherine felt the walls closing in around them. The Dowager had thought of everything, planned for every contingency. There seemed to be no escape from her web of manipulation and murder. But then Alexander laughed. It was a sound full of genuine amusement, and it made his mother's confident expression falter for the first time. You've made one crucial mistake, Mother, he said, pulling a second letter from his jacket pocket. You assumed Dr. Whitfield was working alone. The Dowager's face went pale. What? Magistrate Henry Crawford sends his regards, Alexander continued, his voice gaining strength. Along with his assurance that arrest warrants have been prepared based on Dr. Whitfield's evidence, the Bow Street runners are already on their way to collect James from Bedlam and to arrest you for fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy to commit murder, and illegal imprisonment. As if summoned by his words, the sound of horses and carriage wheels echoed from the drive outside. The Dowager spun toward the window, her composure finally cracking completely. No, she breathed. No, this is impossible. I planned for everything. You planned for everything except the possibility that your victims might survive to testify against you, Catherine said. And you never imagined that your son might choose love over duty. The drawing room doors burst open, and uniformed officers poured in, led by a stern-faced man Catherine recognized from Dr. Whitfield's descriptions. Magistrate Crawford, Alexander said with relief. Perfect timing. Lord Blackwood, the magistrate replied grimly. I'm afraid I have some very serious charges to bring against your mother. As the officers moved to arrest the dowager, she turned one last time to face her son, her expression a mixture of rage and something that might have been disappointment. You're destroying everything, she said. Everything I built, everything I sacrificed for. You built nothing but lies and pain, Alexander replied, and I'm grateful to see it all come down. The last thing Catherine heard as they led the dowager away was the woman's voice, cold and certain. This isn't over. You haven't won anything. You've only destroyed yourselves. But as Alexander's arms came around her, as Victoria wept with relief, as the truth finally came to light after 3 years of darkness, Catherine thought that perhaps destruction could be its own kind of victory. Sometimes you had to burn down everything false to make room for something true. 6 months later, spring had returned to Yorkshire with a vengeance. Catherine knelt in her garden behind the small cottage that Alexander had bought for her in the village, not as a place to hide this time, but as a refuge where they could build something new together. The roses were blooming magnificently, their petals unfurling in shades of pink and white and deep blood red. She'd learned to tend them without fear of their thorns. The scandal had been enormous, of course. The arrest of a dowager countess for multiple counts of murder and conspiracy had dominated London's newspapers for weeks. The revelation that she'd been systematically removing threats to her power through false imprisonment and staged accidents had shocked even the most jaded members of society. James had been found exactly where Dr. Whitfield said he would be, alive but badly damaged by 2 years of unnecessary treatment. He was recovering slowly at a private facility, his mind healing along with his body. The doctors said he would make a full recovery in time, though he might never be quite the same cheerful young man he'd been before his ordeal. Victoria had handled the cancellation of their engagement with more grace than Catherine had expected. Once the truth came out, she'd actually thanked Alexander for saving her life, though she'd retreated to her family's estate in Scotland to recover from the shock of learning she'd nearly married into a family of murderers and madmen. The dowager had been sentenced to transportation to Australia, a fate she declared worse than death, though Catherine privately thought it was more merciful than she deserved. She'd shown no remorse at her trial, maintaining to the end that everything she'd done had been necessary to preserve the Blackwood legacy. As for Alexander, he'd surprised everyone by selling the majority of the Blackwood estate to pay reparations to his mother's victims and to establish a fund for the reform of England's asylums. He'd kept only the cottage where Catherine now lived, and a small income that would allow them to live modestly but comfortably. You don't have to kneel in the dirt for those flowers, you know, a familiar voice said behind her. We could hire a gardener. Catherine smiled without turning around. And deprive myself of the pleasure? I think not. Alexander's arms came around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest as she continued to work. He smelled of leather and sunshine now instead of expensive cologne, and she liked it even better. Letter came from Dr. Whitfield today, he said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. James is doing much better. He might even be well enough to attend our wedding. Our wedding, Catherine repeated, testing the words. Even after 6 months, she sometimes couldn't quite believe they were real. When did you decide on a date without consulting me, my lord? About the same time you decided to accept my proposal without actually saying yes. Alexander replied, spinning her around in his arms. And it's just Alexander now, remember? I renounced the title when I sold the estate. You're still a lord to me, Catherine said, reaching up to touch his face. The lines of worry and guilt that had marked him so deeply were finally beginning to fade, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. Good, he said, leaning down to kiss her forehead, because you'll always be my lady, title or no title. They'd had this conversation before, in various forms. Alexander's decision to give up his inheritance had shocked London society, but Catherine understood it. He needed to be free of his mother's legacy, free of the blood money that had built the Blackwood fortune. They both needed to start fresh, to build something that belonged entirely to them. "There's something else in the letter," Alexander said, his voice growing serious. "Dr. Whitfield thinks he's found others. Other people who were committed on false pretenses, other families destroyed by greed or convenience. He wants to know if we'd be willing to help." Catherine considered this, still cradled in Alexander's arms. 6 months ago, she would have said no. 6 months ago, she'd wanted nothing more than to disappear into anonymity and never think about madhouses or evil dowagers again. But something had changed in her during the long process of bringing Alexander's mother to justice. She'd found her voice again, found her strength. She'd discovered that surviving wasn't enough anymore. She wanted to fight for others who couldn't fight for themselves. "Yes," she said finally. "But not from London. We do it from here, from our home. We help Dr. Whitfield gather evidence. We provide sanctuary for the victims who need it, but we don't lose ourselves in other people's battles." "Agreed," Alexander said immediately. "Our life together comes first. Everything else is just service." Catherine tilted her head back to look at him, studying the face she'd loved for so long. There were still shadows there, still guilt over the years they'd lost and the pain they'd both endured. But there was something else too. Hope, real hope, for the first time since that terrible night 3 years ago. "Do you remember," she said softly, "the night we first met, at the village fair?" Alexander's eyes lit up. "You were selling roses at a booth, and I thought you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I bought every single flower you had just for an excuse to keep talking to you." 27 roses, Catherine recalled with a smile, "and you had no idea what to do with them all." "I gave them to every servant in the manor," Alexander confessed. "The maids were finding rose petals in their rooms for weeks." They both laughed, and the sound was lighter than anything Catherine had felt in years. This was what she'd missed most during her time in Bedlam. Not the grand gestures or passionate declarations, but these quiet moments of shared joy. "I kept one," she said suddenly. "One rose from that first day. I pressed it in my diary, and I carried it with me even there. It's still in my locket." Alexander's expression grew tender. "The locket you never took off, even when you thought I'd betrayed you." "I couldn't," Catherine admitted. "It was all I had left of you, of us." "May I see it?" Catherine hesitated, then reached up to unclasp the silver chain from around her neck. She'd shown him the miniature portrait inside many times, but never the pressed rose hidden in the back compartment. Alexander opened the locket with reverent fingers, carefully extracting the delicate, faded petals. They were brown now, brittle with age, but still recognizably the rose he'd bought from her stand all those years ago. "My God," he breathed. "All this time, you kept it." "Through everything," Catherine confirmed. "Through the madhouse, through thinking you'd abandoned me, through 3 years of believing love was just another kind of madness. I kept it because even when my mind couldn't remember why, my heart knew it mattered." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, turning the fragile petals over in his palm. When he looked up at her again, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Marry me," he said suddenly. "Not someday, not when the scandal dies down, not when society decides we're respectable again. Marry me tomorrow. Marry me today." Catherine felt her heart skip, then begin to race. "Alexander, I'm serious." He dropped to one knee right there in the garden, heedless of the dirt and thorns, holding up the pressed rose like it was the crown jewels. "Catherine Rose, love of my life, keeper of my heart, survivor of hell itself, Will you marry me? Will you take my name and my devotion and whatever future we can build together? The tears came then, hot and fast, and completely without shame. Yes, she whispered. Then louder, yes, of course, yes. I've been waiting 3 years to say yes. Alexander surged to his feet and spun her around, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. When he set her down, he carefully placed the rose petals back in her locket before clasping it around her neck again. There, he said, his hands lingering at her nape, right where it belongs. Catherine reached up to touch the locket, feeling the weight of it against her skin. The same weight she'd carried through the darkest days of her life, the tangible proof that love could survive anything if it was strong enough, true enough, stubborn enough to refuse to die. "Do you remember me?" she asked softly, echoing the words that had started their reunion 6 months ago. Alexander cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears just as they had that night in the ballroom when everything changed. "I remember everything," he said. "Every laugh, every kiss, every moment of joy before the world tried to tear us apart. But more than that, I remember who we're going to be together. All the tomorrows we're going to have, all the roses we're going to plant, all the love we're going to build on the ashes of what tried to destroy us." And as he kissed her there in their garden, surrounded by roses that bloomed despite their thorns, Catherine thought that perhaps some stories were worth waiting for. Some loves were worth fighting for. Some endings were worth all the pain that came before them. The storm had passed. The sun was shining, and they were finally home. "Do you remember me?" she had asked, and his tears had answered before his words. Now, in the garden of their new beginning, they both remembered everything and chose to create something even more beautiful than what they'd lost.